titled A Better Way to Integrate SharePoint and SAP. This webinar, we will show you how to build complex workflows by leveraging and integrating Microsoft SharePoint and SAP without any programming. My name is Teresa Chaki, and I will be your host today, and we will be going through a brief introduction of key performance indicators and an overview of the Winshuttle solution. I would also like to introduce our solutions engineer, Bill Wiseman. Bill will be going through a product demonstration highlighting the features and the functionality of our product. So let's quickly run through the agenda of our webinar. First, we will touch on SharePoint and SAP and why to integrate them, giving example use cases. Then we will have our Winshuttle workflow and forms demonstration. We will highlight the features and the benefits, have a summary wrap-up, and answer any questions. As a reminder, please use the question and answer box on your GoToWebinar control panel to ask your questions at any time. We will do our best to answer in real time. So let's go ahead and get started. First, I want to talk about why integrate SAP and SharePoint. Now, SAP is clearly the system of record for a mass majority of corporation enterprises today. It is the ERP leader in terms of business functionality. It's proven, stable technology that companies use to run their business across the globe. It has built up a large ecosystem of people that can supply, configure, and add to SAP, which is very helpful. It also has a lot of industry solutions. However, with this complexity comes challenges. First is that SAP has a complex user interface, and it often leads to challenges for companies with getting data into SAP in a timely manner. As a result, this also affects the quality of data, which can interfere with the ability to make decisions. SAP also has numerous workflow tools within itself, but they are very difficult and technical to build and use. SAP workflow is not suitable for managing processes outside of SAP. And finally, SAP is only used by a number of employees within an organization. The average is about 20% of employees in a large organization are SAP license holders. Well, on the other hand, there is SharePoint. It is becoming the enterprise portal of choice. In comparison to SAP, it has a simple web-based user interface. It has a lot of collaboration tools within it. It is easy to configure and supported by SAP or by IT. It is easy to administrate, and like SAP, it has a large ecosystem of third-party vendors to be called upon to help configure and adjust. Unlike SAP, it is licensed across a whole enterprise, so nearly every user in an organization has the ability to access a SharePoint site. Its model is collaborating both the business unit and IT to streamline business processes and development. On the downside, SharePoint is not an ERP system. It is not designed as a system of record, and while it does have some workflow capabilities, that too has its limitations. So if you could bring both SAP and SharePoint together and get the best of both worlds, we think there is a huge opportunity to leverage the best components of each of the two systems. For example, with SAP and SharePoint, integrating one of the best things you can provide users is a single web-based entry point to store data within your SAP system record. You can expand the number of participants of an SAP process because more people have access to their web-based interface. You can also get to leverage the investment of SAP and the Microsoft technologies that you've already made today. And finally, you can improve business process and make your enterprise more efficient. When companies first start to engage us, first they must uncover an answer to a simple question. How are we doing it today, and does this process that we have in place make sense for the future and the business of the company? Typically, when engaging with clients, we hear a number of different ways that they're doing workflows, and soon we begin to discover that Winshuttle can help solve the problem of being stuck in custom programming that is very expensive to develop and very costly to implement, paper-based workflows with no rich context for reporting, and email-based workflows with having no capabilities of any kind of approvals or notification statuses, and also electronic workflows that are just not robust, maybe too simple or generic. So what is Winshuttle Workflow? What can I do? With Winshuttle Workflow, you can enforce virtually any type of business process with the capabilities to route documents and forms in electronic workflow, and also being able to see at a glance who did what and when. It gives you a timeline of where things are in a process, and from there you're able to dissect your process and workflow with generated reports and metrics. You can see where any bottlenecks reside and address them. Winshuttle Workflow makes it easy to adapt to changes in business process, which we all know can happen quite frequently. It can decrease work cycle times and increase workplace efficiencies. Also, it can help you get your products out to market quicker. Winshuttle Workflow provides an efficient, reliable, and cost-effective means to create virtually any type of role-based business process without any software coding or consultants. So here is just examples of different use cases of where our customers have placed Winshuttle Workflow. And keep in mind of where you think there would be a good fit for our application. We typically see it in finance, HR, operations, and IT. So here's just an example of a new vendor request form. With Winshuttle Workflow, you have the capability to route this form through several approvals, change form views from each person that it touches, and ultimately load the information into SAP. So without further ado, so we can really dive into the features and the functionality of Winshuttle, I would like to go ahead and pass the baton over to my colleague, Bill Wiseman, who will be running through our solutions demonstration.
Thank you, Teresa. Appreciate that. And can you see my screen and hear me okay?
I can hear you okay, and we can see your screen perfect.
All right, perfect. All right, well, I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate everyone joining this afternoon to allow me to share a little bit about the Winflow solutions integrating SAP and SharePoint. And so we're going to start out the demonstration today with an end-use example. I know that Teresa mentioned several different types of applications where Winshuttle could be leveraged in your business processes. So I'm going to show you an end-use example. We'll walk through the workflow steps and the workflow processes and pointing out some of the advantages of using Winshuttle. And then we will walk through the process of building or authoring the process from end to end. How do we create it? How do we design it? How do we deploy this so that our end users have access to this? And Teresa mentioned that all this really sits on a SharePoint platform. So what this portal provides to your end user, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, but what it does provide to your end user is it's a library of everything that is created. So it's a central repository for everything that you create using Winshuttle. It becomes the central point of secure access for your users to access these things that have been created for them to check out and to consume. It's a place where we can manage the workflow processes. So our end users will have visibility to what is appropriate to them during this workflow processes, and they can contribute to the workflow process. It also provides us with a data governance administrative console. So this allows me to do things like manage the licenses, manage the scheduling of jobs, do research and reporting, log reports, audit reports. It also allows me to have complete control and visibility over who's doing what, with what, when they're doing it, and how they're doing it. So these are all distinct advantages of using this SharePoint environment. And as Teresa mentioned, it also allows me to expand my participant community. So now I can have users that might not necessarily have been engaged in a process because they're not an SAP user, can now be part of a workflow process. So this is my environment, and I'm going to go ahead and log in here and create a new material. So we have a material create form. And as she mentioned, it works across all the different functional areas of SAP. So, master data is big. Also, I mean, human capital management, finance, all these areas are very big with our users leveraging the workflow process. So I'm going to start by creating a new material here. And so I'll play all the parts or all the roles today of all the different participants in the workflow process. And we'll start out as a material clerk, and I'm going to create a new material in my SAP system. Typically, organizations will create materials, will already have maybe a reference material available to them. And so what happens in this process when we're communicating with SAP is we're passing to and from our form a web service. And this web service allows me to communicate with SAP, to pass the data, and also to retrieve data from SAP back to my form. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to create a new material, and I'm actually going to use one. I'm going to search for a reference material. So right off the bat, I'm communicating with SAP. So in this case, this individual does have an SAP license and could access the SAP system. And it should be pointed out that it completely adheres to the roles, the profiles, and all the authorizations and security that you've established in SAP. Using Winshuttle will not allow you to circumvent any of those rules that you've established. So we'll do a quick search. And I'll just put in a range of materials with a description and say, go out to SAP and pull back all the materials that fall into this category. And once I do that, I'll get my choice of alternatives here, and I'll just pick one. And automatically, that's copied into my form. Now, I'm going to create a new material, and I'm going to select a plant in which to create that material. So I'll say, now go out, and using that same web service, or a different web service, go out and extract or read the data from that master record in SAP and return it back to my form. So I'll have a basis for the beginning of my new material. I'll then copy it down in my form. So it's important to point out here, and Teresa mentioned it earlier, is you can have different views of the form as it goes through the process. This view is the view of the initiator, or in this case maybe the material clerk, the person that's starting the process. And you'll see the different views to the appropriate parties as we move throughout the process. Something that's important is to make sure that we have good, valid data within our SAP system. So we want to make sure that we have access to it. So there's that F4 lookup capability if I'm an SAP licensed user, as well as the ability to validate the data within my form before I actually attempt to post that data into SAP. So half the battle with master data is making sure that we're creating good, clean, complete data in our SAP system. So I can validate the data. I can check the data against the business rules that I've established in my SAP system. Something else that might be important is the attachment of maybe documents, attachments of drawings, PDFs, contracts, things of that nature, pictures, whatever the case may be. And I'm just going to grab a file here that we'll attach. And now this is going to be stored, and all of this is stored, as I said earlier, in this central repository. We do have the capability of attaching documentation and loading that documentation into the SAP system as well. So we'll have several steps in this workflow process. It's going to go through the master data team, my manager, the accounting organization, and the plant operations, depending on which plant. And I'll just put in some notes here and save it and route it to the next step. So that's the material clerk has initiated the creation of this new material. So it's being routed on now to different participants. As I mentioned earlier, I'm playing all the parts today, so I'm going to get notification of all these different roles. If I didn't have access to my desktop, if I were away from my desk, maybe in the middle of the day I'm out on the plant floor, then there's always the ability to review documentation from my email device. I could see the form, I could approve the form from my email, and then send a message back to the SharePoint environment that says it's approved. Move it along in the workflow process. We're just going to go ahead and log in here as the accountant. We mentioned different views. Now we see the accounting view. We see that the stuff that the material clerk did is grayed out. We can't change it, but what we have in our view is stuff that's pertinent to the accounting organization. So maybe I need to put in the standard pricing, and then I need to check my pricing before I send it on. And then once I do that, maybe I'll add some notes and process it on. That's the accountant. Now it goes to the operations, the plant operations. So it's going to go to the operations controller in Plant 1000 because that's where we're creating this. And again, it's a different, unique view for this person. You can see that they have all this different information that they may need to complete. And again, validate the data to make sure that it meets with the SAP rules. So multiple levels of approval, different views, different processes, enabling our end users to validate data. You might ask, how would I validate data, or how would I assist the end user if they weren't an SAP licensed user? Well, in that case, what we could do is we could provide validation within the form. So in other words, I could download all my selections and allow that end user just to choose from a list. So there's many different ways that we can validate information within the system. And then ultimately, you know, before we process or before we post it, we want to make sure that it's good and complete. Then someone with an SAP license could validate it in total before posting it. Now it's routed on to the master data governance team for approval. They see the entire picture. They see the material clerk, they see the plant controller, they see the accounting information, they can see all the validation was successful. They can then approve it, send it on, and then finally it goes to the master data team for creation or updating my SAP system. So we're taking the parts of a material creation. I mean, to think about it, that could be 25 different screens if we're creating a finished good. And taking that, enabling different participants to contribute to the process, and then when we culminate all this information, we have the complete material master record for our company. We could validate again in total if we wanted to, or we could just go ahead and call another web service that's going to take this information in total, the credentials, the transaction, and the data within the transaction, pass it to my SAP system, and then it's going to create that new material in my SAP system. We'll approve it, and then finally what we'll look at is the audit log that comes along with it. So now we can see the complete picture stored here, archived in our SharePoint database that allows me to see the material form, what was done, how it was done, who were the participants, what they did, time, date, stamp, a complete audit log. And this is in addition to the log or changes and the change event log in your SAP system. All that still exists just as if you would have created that material through the user interface of SAP. All right, so that's the end user experience. As I mentioned, you know, there's different applications across different functional areas. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to actually take a process, we're going to create a process, we're going to record an SAP transaction. We are then going to publish that to that Winshuttle SharePoint environment. Remember, I told you it becomes a repository for everything that we create. So we record our SAP transaction, we publish it into that SharePoint environment, then we'll take that web service that we created through that recording, design a form, design or model a workflow, and then publish that back out to that portal so that now the end user has access to it and can consume it. So that's what we're going to walk through now. So it starts with the creation of a transaction or the recording of a transaction. And I'm just going to do a material change transaction. So it's a three-step process: record, map, and run. So we'll start by recording. And as you see, I have to have the appropriate credentials and authorizations to access my SAP system. What is nice about it is I can take my Winshuttle license and I can use it across my various instances of SAP. So you might have a test environment or a QA environment before things move into a production environment. So you can use your Winshuttle license across all those different environments. And so basically what's taking place is a recording process of the transaction. And so I'm just going to put in some information, select some views, make some changes. We'll put in material group and division and maybe the gross weight, net weight, weight unit. And what happens is it records all of these fields in every screen that I go into in my SAP system. So as I navigate through the screens, I'm capturing all the fields, not just the ones that I touch and change, but all the fields. And so what that really speaks to, as Teresa mentioned earlier, is the agility of the solution. If my process changes, if my transaction changes, I can simply update it and republish it. If my workflow changes, I make my changes and republish it. If my form changes, I make my changes and republish it. I don't have to recreate the wheel every time I want to change my business process. So once we make our recording, we'll just save that. Winshuttle will finalize that. And then we go through the process of publishing a web service. And so the next step is the mapping. So what we're going to see here really is the results of what we did in that recording process. And here we make our choice as to what is our user interface going to be, and dependent upon that, that's how we'll map this solution. And so we completed our recording successfully. Now we move into the second step, which is the mapping. And so what you see are a couple of different views, a basic view and an expert view. The basic view is really what you see is what you did. So there's material, description group. These are the fields that I touched and changed. By default, we can see an Excel template. So if I wanted to just map this to an Excel template, it's just a simple graphical drag and drop process of mapping to my template. We might use this type of a user interface if we were going to create a mass number of materials or do a mass number of changes to materials. Now today we're going to create a form, a single-use form. I want to give you a look at the expert view here so that you can see what I mentioned just a minute ago. We see the field, the screens that we went into, the fields that we touched and changed, and then we also see the fields that we didn't use, but now if I wanted to enable any of those fields, I could simply do it from here. So that flexibility and that agility to change. So what we're going to do today is create a form. So now my format changes from Excel to a form. And this allows me to publish that web service that we're going to consume in our form design. I'm just going to save my form here. All right. So once we do this, then we can publish our web service. All right. Once we publish that web service, let's step back here to our our graphic here. We recorded, we mapped, and we published our web service. Now that's going to reside in this central environment. And now I'm going to start with the design process. So let's move into the designer. So this is the blank template of the designer. What we're going to do today is we're going to take that transaction web service and design our form and our workflow. So in order to do that, I need to bring in my transaction script. So I'll just bring in my script. And I'm going to allow for overriding here. So if things change, then things will change, and we can allow them to change. There's a process by which you can manage the life cycle of these building processes, from maybe a development to a stage to final production. So we can retain and change things as we move through the process. The solution allows for that. In addition, we want to create our place that this is going to reside. So I have mapped this to the same portal interface that you saw earlier in the demonstration. And now what we want to do is we want to create our form. So before we do that, I'm going to add my web service to my form. So we'll go out here and we'll select the web service that we imported. Give it a classification, say OK. And now you see it's instantiated here. So the things that we did, the things that we touched and changed are included here. Now I'm going to generate my InfoPath form. And now I'm going to launch into the design of the form. Now you could do this in any order you wanted to. You could design the form first, or you could design the workflow first. And you should also remember that if you have workflows out there, or you have forms out there already in existence, you can leverage those. So if I've already got a workflow and I need to create a new form, I can just attach my old workflow to my new form, or vice versa. So we don't have to continually recreate the wheel. So now we're going to launch into the design of the form. We need to save it. I'll just put it on my desktop and save it. So now it's going to take that instantiated transaction and it's going to add it into the forms designer here. And so what you see over here basically are the things that we did in the design of the transaction or the recording of the transaction. These are the fields that we touched and changed. So now I need to go ahead and start designing a form. So we're going to call this a change material form. And I'm just going to import my fields into my form. If we want to, we can insist that each individual user input their credentials here, or we can store the credentials in that central SharePoint environment and attach them there. I'm going to bring in my log field information so that I'll have my results that come back from SAP. So there's one step left here before we finish the design of this form, and that is to add in the Winshuttle controls. Now that's really the secret sauce that Winshuttle brings. So first of all is the process control, and this allows me to publish that integrated form and that workflow process into that SharePoint environment. The other control I want to add in this case is the web service control. Now my web service control is going to allow me to actually call the SAP transaction that we installed in our form here. And so we'll define that web service. So let's add our web service to our form now. Again, you see it instantiated here in the design. And then I'm going to say, when I press this button, I want to post this transaction to SAP. And I'll just go ahead and apply it. So we recorded the transaction. We published a web service. We then took that web service from that central environment. We instantiated it in our designer, published it in our form. We've designed our form. We've added our controls. And now we're just going to save our form here and work back to our workflow. All right, so we've done the half of the work in our design, which is the forms piece of it. Now what we want to do is we want to design the workflow. So what we have by default is the originator and then the process owner. Now the process owner is really nothing more than the person that controls or authors this process. What I want to do is I want to add another participant here for approval's sake, and we're going to call that person the manager. So we're just going to add a manager. So we're really just adding a lane of workflow to our design. That's what we're doing. Here we have a lane, here we have a lane, here we have a lane. And we're going to use the originator and the manager in this process today. Now all I need to do is design the workflow. Well, so far everything you've seen has been fairly non-programmatic and graphical in nature. We recorded the transaction. We mapped. All that was very graphical and non-programmatic. We then designed our form. I think you'll agree that that was in the same fashion. And now we're going to design our workflow. All the functions have already been created for us here. So starting and ending and activities and approvals, they're already embedded here, and all I need to do is design them within my workflow. So we'll start the process with the originator. We'll include an approval step here. We're going to add a couple of email notifications. So one if we approve, one if we reject, and then we'll just end the process with either or an approve or reject. So it starts with the material clerk, goes to his manager. If it is approved, it'll take this route with an email notification, and if it is rejected, it'll take this route. Now, I've built a fairly simple process for this demonstration today. Just imagine you could build a more dynamic solution, much like the one I showed you earlier, with multiple levels of approvals, with group approvals, with routing workflow based on the population of an object, with things like escalation procedures, so that if a particular stop occurs in your workflow process, then it's rerouted to someone else. So very much more colorful and dynamic solutions can be created with our workflow solution. But here we have a pretty simple, straightforward process to go along with the form that we've designed. And so now we're ready just to, we're going to assign it to a particular SAP system in this case. So I'll give it my SAP instance, say OK. We'll save it once again, and now we're ready to publish that complete solution back into that SharePoint environment. So here we recorded, we mapped, we published our web service from our recording. We obtained the web service, we modeled our workflow, we designed our form. Now we're publishing it back into the SharePoint environment so that our end user will have access to the process. And so we'll go in here and we'll check out our new process. And there is our new material change form. And so we'll just begin filling out the form. And as I said, you know, the example earlier was much more colorful. You can be much more robust in your design of your process. But what I wanted you to get a feel for today was how easily, how simply, how non-programmatically we can integrate SAP to this SharePoint environment. So now that we can not only include SAP participants in the process, but we can also include non-SAP people in these processes as well and really expand the participant community across these various business processes. So we'll complete our process. Our manager now receives the form, and the manager has the capability of posting these changes into our SAP system, and we'll see the return log file information coming back to our transaction, and we'll see that our material descriptions and things were changed within our particular master record. We'll just finally go ahead and approve it, and then again, you have the workflow process here. So that is really how it works from start to finish. You saw a nice end-use example, and you saw us walking through the complete authoring process. At this time, what I'll do is I'll turn it back over to our host, Teresa, who will open it up for any questions that might be out there and maybe give you some further direction and maybe some further resources that are available to you.